I'm the managing director at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice here at the law school. I want to welcome you on behalf of Dean Minow and Charles Ogletree to the law school. This is a really special occasion and an exciting event. I think we're all really lucky and fortunate to be able to attend the screening. We're about to see have our minds fed, but also a lot of creativity. So I want to get straight to it and only briefly say that what we'll do is we'll have the screening, and then we'll have a little break, and after the break we'll be able to talk to the filmmaker and spend some time. Between the screening and that talk, we'll be able to find the bathroom, find any more food if there's any left, and then we'll adjourn. The final preliminary I want to do is kind of remind you of some things that we have going on at the Institute in the near future. Next Thursday, we'll be conducting a forum on criminal justice with the candidates for governor. That'll be 6 o'clock. That'll also be here in Wasserstein down the hall. On the 25th, we're really lucky to have a world-known photographer, Richard Ross, who will come and talk about and present his photographs of juveniles in justice. These are photographs of young people who are incarcerated, which will be exhibited on the 3rd floor here for a few weeks, and he'll be talking on March 25th. On April 3rd, we're going to be showing another film called The Waiting Room. This is a fantastic film about a day in the life of an emergency room in Oakland, California. It's an award-winning film. It's really excellent. That's April 3rd. And then on April 17th, we'll be showing Free Angela, a film, very new film about Angela Davis, and I think you'll find that also very interesting. And it'll also be here in Wasserstein. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you our co-sponsor for the event. And one other thing. I often forget to give thanks and praise where thanks and praise are due. So there are two people I really feel I have to acknowledge. One is my colleague, Ernest Owens, who can't be here tonight, but who does an incredible amount of work doing the arrangements for our events and making sure that we have room, space, food, and media services and all of that. And then the other is our colleague at the Warren Center, Arthur Pattenhock, who has also done an incredible amount of work working with a number of other collaborators to make tonight happen. Now I'm going to introduce Professor Laurel Ulrich, distinguished historian and the 300th anniversary professor here at Harvard University. Sorry, the narrow view, right? She's the winner of numerous awards, including Pulitzer and Bancroft Prizes in history for A Midwife's Tale, which many of you know. Her most recent book, Well-Behaved Women Seldom Make History, bears on the obvious relation to today's film, Rebel, and which found its genesis, the film, at the Warren Center itself. Professor Ulrich was also the director of the Warren Center and kind of ran a themed workshop, film in history, film as history. So with no further ado, I give you Professor Laurel Ulrich, who will introduce the film. Professor.
That is a very long introduction for a very brief comment that I'm going to make, which is to say that this is a wonderful moment for those of us who were here when Maria Carter was a fellow at the Charles Warren Center, and several others are here this evening, and we hope we'll be able to share some of our experiences when this was just an idea. So it's very exciting to see this film come to fruition. And we're going to go right to the film because I know you're anxious. And then after the film, we'll have a good discussion. So have some good comments and questions ready. So I am really delighted to introduce Maria to us. And for those of you who are students, she was an undergraduate at Adams House and then for a time in the co-op. She was a concentrator in anthropology and then moved into VES and worked with the legendary Robert Gardner in documentary filmmaking. She then, I should have begun. Maria was born in Ecuador. She's a true dreamer who came here as an undocumented immigrant and then came on to graduate from Harvard College and to move on to WGBH, where she worked on the series La Plaza, and then moved up into PBS National Productions, and then a few years ago founded her own company, Iguana Films Incorporated. She has many, many honors, which you can read on the website for Iguana Films. I think the interesting thing is she can tell us how long she worked on this film. This was really a labor of love. In the meantime, very recently, she completed a film called No Job for a Woman, which was about women reporters in World War II. So she dealt with women in the military in that project as well. And I don't want to take any more time because I want us to hear from her. Any comments you want to make, Maria, and then we can take some questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you, Laura. And I just have to say that the year that I spent developing this project as a Warren Fellow was the first year that I really got a chance to think about this project very, very deeply. And one of the things that I was thinking so deeply about is who gets to tell our stories? What does a nation choose to remember, and what does a nation choose to forget? And of course, I am deeply drawn to stories about communities that may not have been deemed worthy of archiving, photographing, collecting the history of. And so in particular, this story was not only this fascinating woman with the growth of a moral arc herself, right? She kind of takes this journey. She starts in the Confederacy. By the end of her life, we know that she is actually urging the U.S. to become involved in the liberation of Cuba in the 1870s, late 1870s. You can find one of her speeches to Congress. So even after the Civil War, she continues to be a public person and is writing against slavery. So this person has a moral arc herself, but what is so fascinating to me, and the reason I made the film, is because she was actively erased. And so that question of who gets to choose who tells our history was really central to my making the film, and I really can't thank the Warren Center enough for helping to guide me, and also my fellows, some of whom are here. Laurie Kahn, who is a very accomplished filmmaker. Vince Brown, who teaches here, is also a very accomplished filmmaker, and happy to take any questions that you have.
Oh, question about? I'm sorry, you know, I'm here accidentally. I just went
Oh.
back to it and we live in the same house, and I saw her in the dining hall this morning. And we had dinner 2 days ago, and she told me she was going to see this film. And I was like, oh shoot, that sounds interesting. I want to see that. And then I saw your poster at the Divinity School, and then I saw it again. I was like, I need to go see that. And I just thought that I was supposed to be here. But now I'm astounded and overwhelmed at the story that you saw. Like, I'm trying to stay in my seat because I don't want to disrupt the people around me. I'm a really involved listener. But the story you told is so brilliant. she walked away and she was seen crying. But I was like, oh, she's strong, she's not supposed to cry. And I felt like she was feminized in a way that, which I'm sad that I say that because I said it like it's a bad thing, but femininity is a beautiful thing, right? So I apologize, but just for the sake of language, I felt like she was feminized in a way. I was like, no, I want to see her walk away with her chin up and unmoved, but then I realized that she humanized her in her crying. I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about it. It could go either way. But so that was frustrating. But I was like, no, that made this a beautiful moment of humanity in that she did face this man. Okay, I'm wrapping up. I'm sorry.
That's
she did face this man. She did face this man, and maybe she felt a little bit defeated. But you are part of the reason that her story lives on. That people like you who have no idea who she was could sit here and be so taken in. I'm just overwhelmed. I'm grateful. And I'm going to shut up.
I'm thrilled that you've asked that, and I'm thrilled you ended with that question of her speaking to Jubal Early, because I was very careful not to have dialogue throughout the film. I was looking for a silent film star, and I found that person in Romy Diaz, who portrayed Loreta. And one of the things that's very interesting to me is the question of her speaking out after having been silenced. And the book outlives Jubal Early and her, and is able to speak on for her. And so one of the things that is interesting to me is that although we hear her voice in the printed word, we see it. I tried to keep reminding you throughout the film that this is based on a memoir and someone's written word. I also am deliberately not having her speak dialogue, except when she tries to speak to Jubal Early, and her words fall on deaf ears. And so it was a deliberate aesthetic choice to do that and to have her silenced in her time. But as Vicky Ruiz, the historian, says, she's more important as an author than a soldier, because what's really radical about her is that she writes, she's one of only 2 Latinas to have published books in the 19th century in the US, in all of the US. And for so long, this book has been considered a hoax or a fraud. And so we know from archival documents that her story is based on truth. There's lots and lots of archival documentation. And what I find so fascinating is how ready we are to continue to dismiss her. There's one article on the internet from the 1970s that continues to pop up. It's called Heroine or Hoaxer. And the scholar Sylvia Hoffert was one of my advisors, who I encouraged to speak in the film and to continue to comment. And she said, you know, I can no longer stand by that article, because when I wrote it, a lot of the research on the women soldiers had not been done. And so subsequently it was done, and I no longer can stand by that. That was really fascinating to me that, you know, scholars are so sophisticated and able to say, well, I no longer stand by that. There's a new reality because we found new documentation, and that's what makes someone like Sylvia Hoffert so brilliant, too, to be able to continue to expand their own knowledge base as well and collaborate with other scholars.
Right.
Laurel, can you ask people to use the mics because it's for the filming? Can you use the mics, please?
There's a mic right behind you.
Okay.
I'm curious about the question of what her language was. Presumably Spanish was her first language in Cuba, but it's not really clear what her experience is when she goes to New Orleans, which is partly English speaking, partly French speaking. And at what point does her English become so fluent that she can then, you know, fit into this Confederate military structure where she has other difficulties fitting in as well? And then when she wrote her memoir, I assume it was in English, and I'm just curious about the role of language, because as you pointed out, it was mainly a silent movie in terms of her direct speech. So what can you tell us about that and her early education?
She arrived at 7 years old in New Orleans. And like many of the upper classes of the time, the women would be sent to complete their education in many of the Catholic schools that were in New Orleans at the time in the U.S. And the many Latin American families would send their children off to school. The men would be sent to Europe to study. And she would have probably learned in French. A lot of the schools were teaching in French. She would have been trilingual. She, in the memoir, talks about having an English-speaking nanny in Cuba. Her mother was part French and part American. Her father was a Spanish diplomat and plantation owner in Cuba, and she's the first of the children to be born in Cuba. So she's the first child to be a Creole, to be born in the New World. That would have meant that even if she had been a man, she could not hold public office. There are specific things that were not allowed of the Creoles in the New World in the colonies. And so Havana was still a colony. When she moved to the US at age 7, she would have quickly picked up English and spoken it perfectly, as I do. I moved to the US, and so you wouldn't hear a trace of a Spanish accent at all in this person. And then she would have picked up the editor speaks of her as an incredible mimic. And so I'm assuming that she was able to pick up different dialects and accents pretty well. And she would have grown up in New Orleans, which, very interestingly, people say that the New Orleans accent sounded kind of Brooklyn, but that would have been for the working classes. That wasn't the case for the more educated classes. So I actually did a lot of research to try to figure out how to give a lilt that would be historically appropriate, and worked with a dialect coach from that area, and together we kind of came up with the kind of accent that she carries, which is partly based on contemporary upper class New Orleans accents, and with some knowledge of that earlier 19th century speech.
How did you choose to make this film, and what is your main message you want to tell with this film?
Well, I think I'm fascinated by a couple of things. As a Latina, there are so few of us Latina filmmakers making films to begin with, and I'm very active in a group called NALIP, the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, which includes Hollywood and network and public media, Latino producers and writers and directors. And certainly we make up a very, very tiny percentage of the voices that create the media images that we see today of Latinos in contemporary society, in fiction, and in the media images that we are bombarded with. And so there are these stereotypical images staring at us all the time, stereotypical stories staring at us all the time. We're thugs, we're house cleaners, we mow your lawn. Seldom does the immigrant story include someone who might be an agent of a pivotal moment of American history, and certainly not of the American Civil War, which is really thought of as a black-white affair. And certainly there's a centrality to that, of course, the slavery question being the burning question throughout the Civil War. You can't deny that. But what is so fascinating to me is that there are 10,000 Mexicans fighting after the US-Mexican War for the North and for the South. And that inclusion of all these immigrant groups who for generations have tried to prove their citizenship and their patriotism through fighting for a nation's war, and of course in the case of the South, it would have been fighting for the Confederacy. So fascinating to me. And as one of our scholars says, you fight those nations' wars and you don't always win the prize at the end. And so that was why we looked very hard to find this amazing photograph of these Native American Confederate veterans, right, who are very aged and holding these Confederate flags. And I think oftentimes the photography speaks for itself, that incredible archival photography.
Do you want to say a bit more about that? Because that is so striking. the variety of photographs that you used, and where did you go to find these?
Well, we spent years looking through many, many archival collections, from private collections to public collections at the National Archives, in specific collections. You know, one of the photos of the female to male soldier is actually here at the Boston Public Library. There's so many. One of the things that is really fascinating to me is when I was thinking about this story, there was only one not authenticated photograph of Loreta, and I was so deeply enmeshed in the story that I thought, how will I convey this? And one of my concepts was to create my own family album, so to speak. So I studied Civil War photography of the time, the conventions, what did they have in the rooms, what did the backdrops look like, and so forth. And I tell you from the very beginning that there's only one not authenticated photograph, and so you're supposed to know when you see photographs, even family albums, photographs of Loreta, that these are constructed by the filmmaker, of course, but they're playing off against actual archival photographs. And to me, one of the things that's fascinating is in reading about the making of these archival photographs, they took a very long time, of course, because the process was just so different at the time. And one of the things that Matthew Brady, our famous Civil War photographer that we know about, he would move the bodies and create his own scapes, you know, his own photographic compositions of the reality that he conceived of at the time. So these archival photographs that we think of as frozen truth, are they really those frozen truths? Because any photographer knows that every time you click that camera and you choose a frame, you're choosing not to put other things in the frame. And so she could take a photograph of me right now and only show those photographs of me, and Laurel would be out of the picture and wouldn't exist, right? Likewise, there are so many ways that you can create a statement about the truth of a reality in a photograph. So I was playing with that, and sometimes a photograph would move, or a moving picture would be drained of color. So you'd think about the act of making. There are other things that some people have never mentioned or picked up on. I wonder if people think about them. The performance aspect of the film itself. I used the same actress to play Loreta, as an adult. I also used the same actress to play her aunt. And part of it is about thinking of the performative aspect of this woman writing a memoir and creating a story for you to think about and decipher, right? And then I deliberately show you a sequence where she's written one thing in her memoir, and in history we find something else. And to make you think about the performative aspect of what is she trying to do. You know, there are some things that are, like history, ultimately unknowable, right? But there are some things that we can triangulate, and that is what's so delicious about history, really, because it is political, right? George Orwell said, who controls the present controls the past, who controls the past controls the future. And so questions about what is the role of each of these different groups in our nation's history are central to the stories we tell about ourselves every day. You know, I remember when I was thinking about this film, Iraq War and women and soldiers, and one of the big stories at the time was Jessica Lynch, remember that beautiful petite blonde, there was a Lifetime movie made about her. She was on the cover of People magazine, and she's the first woman injured, and she's saved in this daring rescue, actually orchestrated by Bush's PR firm. She's rescued daringly, and she comes back to the US, and we hear all about, you know, this brave woman, Jessica Lynch. And she was kind of the face of female in the military. There was a kind of sexiness, there was a desirability to this woman being involved and fighting for her country. Now, coming back with her in body bags were the men that were lost and died in that truck, and the truck driver, whose name was Lori Piestawa, a Native American Latina single mother of two, whose story was not as desirable. She's the first woman to die. in Iraq, but we never heard that story. And that really kept striking me. All these stories, what do we talk about and what don't we talk about? Then years later, Ken Burns's World War II epic, the 14 hours World War II story told by Ken Burns, who I admire tremendously. He's a fantastic storyteller, and I watched, riveted, the entire Civil War series. And in that World War II series, there were no stories of Latino World War II vets. Now, if anybody knows about the Latino civil rights movement, it was those Latino World War II vets that came back and began, and were, the GI Forum, so many of them, who began that civil rights movement for Latinos in the US. And although the stories were shot in LA and in Texas, there were no Latino Civil War vets found for that story. And that became a point of contention, and eventually those stories were added. But it was very, very striking to me that here we were, in 20, whatever it was, 10 or so, and we had this entire sector of society. And right around that time, we were also seeing the census figures of the amazing growth of Latinos in the US. So you would have thought, well, here's something that's germane to contemporary society. Let's look at what those vets did in World War II, right?
Wow, I've come up with and forgotten 30 more questions.
Sorry.
The thing I've always wondered how that myth of the Southern gentleman got established, because they became rednecks and lynchers so soon afterward. Where was it the generals telling the story, or how did that myth get pushed? And I guess you sort of answered it in the way that people's PR firms wanted things to look that way, so they made it look that way. But the story reminds me of the Old Breed, I think it was called, by a writer named Sledgehammer was his nickname. But the Band of Brothers Pacific was based on it. And if you read that, it's just horrifying. Anyone who reads that book and then thinks war is a good idea, it's just horrifying. 60,000 guys killed on one island, and that's. So there are these books, but it's marginalized. All my life, all I ever saw was rah rah. World War II was great. So anyway, I guess the question, it still goes on, this whitewashing, and hopefully you'll still continue trying to reveal the truth behind the whitewash. So yeah, how the Southern gentleman thing get established, and then what makes me most want to read the book myself is the question of following the money, because that is, Charlie Chaplin's great movie, Monsieur Verdoux, says, why should I be, I've killed 10 women. These munitions guys are responsible for millions of deaths. Just following the money is such a rare thing in wars. And to us, it's so obvious, the Halliburtons and the dynasties of Bushes and all that really made a lot of money out of this. So I'm curious to read the book myself, but also wondered what else she might have said about it.
Fascinating. I'll start with the myth of the Southern gentleman. It was very much a deliberate thing. During Reconstruction, of course, the South lost. Northern historians and publishing industry very strong. South destroyed, so publishing industry also destroyed. And Southern Historical Association in the South, a bunch of Confederate generals actually got together. Jubal Early was at the center of this. The Southern Historical Association was the publishing arm, really, of many of the memoirs. He wrote the first one, and people would actually write their memoirs and send them. They would mail them to Jubal Early, and he would redline them and sort of guide people. He said, we may not have won the war with the sword, we will win it with a pen. And so it was a very concerted effort to think about how to reconstruct that romantic vision of the South. And what's fascinating today is in many of the reenactments all over of Civil War battles, they can't find enough Northern reenactors. I remember when we were shooting the reenactment of the Battle of Bull Run, We were told, Calvin Lindsay, my producer and dear colleague, who is not here because of a family illness, he was going to be here today. He's African American and has worked with me for over a decade on other films in the past, including one on censorship of early jazz and hip hop, which is about fear of blackness and sexuality. And Calvin and I went to do some of our early scouting, and we went to Bull Run, and we were told where to park, which happened to be next to this truck with a 12-foot Confederate flag, and some guys coming out with their overalls, and one guy who had a T-shirt for this reenactment, which said, "If at first you don't succeed, try again." Very terrifying. And Calvin turned to me and said, "We're not going to be here past sundown, are we?" Because it's very concerning. But there's still, what are the things that are being sold the most in that world, the commerce world of reenactment? It's images of General Lee. There is still this romance of the South and that world that never really existed. And so it's still very much alive, that kind of underdog, honor, South, which also means happy mammies and dancing blackface and all of these things that are underneath all that, which we also understand to be the case. The question about the memoir, that's really, to me, it's a 600-page memoir. I hate to say it's not well written. It goes on in this florid Victorian language, so I really pulled out of that the narrative. However, the parts about her spying and her collaborating with all kinds of people, that is very interesting, and there's much less written about that, of course, because she's doing espionage, and so that in particular, a lot of people have found very useful, and the whole, I would say, the last third of the book is about that, and historians have done things like connected, times and places that she talks about to specific movements, like the Copperhead movement, and placed her in different times and places. And of course, some of the documentation that we have is about her spying for the North, right? So, okay. So it was published in both the North and the South, in Richmond and in Connecticut. It was sold by subscription. So this is not like high literature. This is the kind of popular culture journalism, which made it even more dangerous, I think, to those Confederate generals, is that, ladies were reading this, and it was popular stuff. So that was very disturbing, because she's writing about sexuality, she's writing about the corruption of wartime society, she's writing, imagining herself as this character that enters war, the last bastion of male domain. And so in post-war America, post-Civil War America, where everybody wants the women to get back into the house. Now they've entered all kinds of new jobs. Clerks, right? Clerks in the war industry. They've become nurses. That wasn't okay before the war. That was really not done. Actually, most of the nurses were African Americans, actually, during the Civil War. We never see images of that, but they were. Teachers. Women were not teachers before the Civil War. So they've entered the public world, and they took over the businesses that the men had left. And in the South, you have 3 out of 4 military-age men end up fighting in the Civil War. So you realize, how much women had to step into those old roles. So really, people wanted them back in. Get back in there, because the men are returning. They want their old jobs back and their old roles back. And the women are not willing to do that. And Loreta's book is one of these many books of what people would call the scribbling women, pejoratively called scribbling women, imagining women in these new positions.
But it's in print. And did it go out of print for a while and then come back with the women's movement, maybe?
It's interesting. It seems to have been reissued again and again, this kind of underground book. I actually found an original copy. I was doing internet searches kind of I'm a bit of a nerd, and I would do kind of internet searches for Latino this and that and war, and I was very interested. You know, Iraq was happening, all these things were happening, and I came across the title, and it was sitting in the bowels of Widener Library, an original copy, 1876 copy. So I went and read it. But it's available on Amazon now, and it's also an online version is available for free from University of North Carolina. They have a Southern document, Southern Memoirs, and you can go and read the whole thing, and you can read Jubal Early's memoir also, where he talks about how the slaves were better off as slaves. They were happy as slaves. Scary stuff.
Great. Yeah, that.
Hi. I also live in the co-op, and I am a VS concentrator, so I feel a great affinity. I have a couple of questions. The first is about the portrayal of violence in the film, and
what?
the portrayal of violence in the film. And so it's really interesting to hear you talk about reenactments and how that influenced you. I'm wondering what decisions you made in, for example, starting with the portrayal of violence and the reenactment of the battle, and that's what introduces us to the narrative, and what made you do that, and how you're thinking, or how you thought about showing us violence first, and then talking about it later, as you know, how she talked about violence in her memoir and how she chose to portray the battle. That's the first question. And then another question I have is, I'm wondering how much you wanted the audience to doubt as we watched the film, because I noticed that only later in the film do you really reveal that, because I didn't know much about the story beforehand, so I didn't know that the existing narrative is her story being a hoax. And so that only is revealed at the end, and I am introduced to this character as a true story, and only through the experts, you know, showing us the archives, giving us some doubt, that only comes in the middle and the end of the film. So how were you thinking about shaping the audience's perspective? And the last, question is, how did existing narratives of women posing as men in battle influence you? For example, the Mulan narrative or that kind of thing. How did that shape the way that you made decisions in this film? Thanks.
Okay. So the first question, opening with war, the opening sequence, you'll notice if you think about the structure starts in the middle of her story with her smack in the middle of battle. Actually, it's a burial scene. She's going to go gather bodies. So the violence has actually already been enacted, and then she herself, there's a shrapnel explosion. She herself gets hit. And part of that was a decision to hook you from the very beginning into the center of her story. If you start with her, she was born and this and that, you don't know why you're in that story. So it was an attempt to grab you from the beginning in the center of the story, and then you go backwards because now you're hooked and you see this, it's a high point, it's a narrative high point. So it's about hooking an audience structurally, narrative high point, and then you go backwards to the beginning of her film until you meet up with that midpoint again, and then you go forward. So the midpoint shows up in the middle of the film later, but you started with it in the beginning. So it's a kind of twisty story, and that connects actually to the question of why not say that she's a hoax, and why start with her as a real story. This is something that I just want to point out. Bernice Schneider, just wave, Bernice, my brilliant editor, with whom we grappled together over these questions for a very long time. So you've asked structural questions. And that is about the fact that you need to be hooked as an audience to go with her, because if we open and tell you she's a hoax from the very beginning, you won't go into that story. And really, the story is about believing and disbelieving, and about the fact that sometimes you have to suspend belief. When I was doing some of the original research, most filmmakers don't have to do original research, and for the most part, I relied on incredible historians. Sometimes I wanted to know specific things myself, so I wanted to follow certain threads. There was one about a story of a particular ship that she put some men on, and they travel from one place to another. And I hired a very renowned Civil War archival researcher who came back and said, that story's gotta be untrue because that ship belonged to the Union. And so she couldn't have put a bunch of Confederate people. Well, I then later on had this crafty little researcher in a historical grad student at Tulane who followed up on that same story. I said, you know, something doesn't sit right with me. Can you just follow up on this? And it turns out that that ship had been a Confederate ship in the beginning of the war when she talks about it, and later captured by the Union and ends up being a Union ship. And the reason I say this is because if we go into a story disbelieving it from the beginning, we're going to read and follow certain clues and sometimes not follow others if our mind is not open. And so I wanted your mind to be open when you came at it. There's another simple example, and that is the brilliant film called Capturing the Freedmans, one of my all-time favorite films. And Capturing the Freedmans is a son talking about his father who is being arrested as a child molester, okay? And it isn't until 2/3 of the way into the film that you actually find out that he was actually a pedophile. He may or may not have done this crime for which he's been arrested, but he was actually a pedophile. But in the first 2/3 of the film, you see him as a human being. And you are able to watch the complexity of a human being, and then you judge that in its shades of gray. And Loreta is that kind of person. It's the reason, that complexity is one of the reasons I was so drawn to that character. Because the other thing is, when our entire history as the Latino peoples in the US has not been told, we are asked as Latino filmmakers and storytellers to tell only the stories of blaster saints, you know? And that means someone like now if you think about it, if you thought about that, because we know white history so much better, we can have John F. Kennedy who womanized, right? But he's still John F. Kennedy. He still has all these shades of gray, and he did some good and some bad, etc. But when we're looking at Latino history and we're talking about this void of nothingness, and we see one person who's complicated and not perfect and so on and so forth, Latinos themselves feel the burden of telling a story that is not shaded. And same with, you know, Black history and so on and so forth. So one of my favorite books is Michael Eric Dyson's biography of Martin Luther King, because he shows the man a complexity, and really, ultimately, those are the best heroes, because they're human like us, and we can come closer to them.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much.